started on our gender, sex, sexuality, sexual orientation stuff, but we're gonna go through this first. Okay, so these are I get so confused with words and stuff. Okay. So I think I got everything caught up with this one. Okay. Okay. So when we come back, we're gonna do the midterm debates, which is gonna be on capital punishment. Okay, so we've covered everything that I really think we need to cover in order to have a better understanding of economic situations, of race, racism, and prejudice, when we look at the idea of capital punishment in the United States. Okay. I have two sources that are pro, or three sources that are pro, two sources that are anti. So in support of the death penalty, what do you guys think that's gonna be about?
Why we think the death penalty is a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. And then death is different. What do you think that might be about? Which side do you think that might be on?
Probably against it.
Yeah. Ernest van den Haag, the ultimate punishment, a defense. Do you think that's pro or anti?
Pro.
Yep, pro, in defense of the ultimate punishment. And then Larry Tift, inequality in the penal system vis-a-vis the death penalty. Does anyone know what vis-a-vis means? Okay, new word to add to your vocabulary. Vis-a-vis means through or within. Okay, it's just a fancier way of saying it. Sounds like you've got a little bit of an education. It's a French word, it always sounds better. So what do you think that is, pro or anti? Anti, inequality, right? That's right in that type. A lot of times you can tell through the type. Larry Tiff's is gonna be your hardest read. Both of these are from the 80s, and we talked about data, that things have changed dramatically since the 1980s, so you have to double check your data. But it's very heavily philosophical. You're gonna need to have your phone out so you can look up words, and you will have to read paragraphs and probably 2 times before you move on to the next one. Okay, and that's fine. These are the papers, both of them, and same thing with Van den Haag, but not as severe. Van den Haag's is a little more organized. Van den Haag takes the 5 arguments that abolitionists make against the death penalty and tries to tear them apart. So he has them numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Larry Tift meanders. He takes you on a ride, on a journey, right? So it sounds like sometimes he's pro, but then knowing that the paper's anti, wait till the other shoe drops as you're reading on. And I want you to get used to these, because as you get into the professional journal articles in the field you're going into, no matter what field that is, it's going to be heavily more technical than what you're used to as a layperson who's entering their 1st or 2nd year of college. So it's going to be far more difficult with each step that you take on the road to what field you're going into. So there will be different terminology than there will be in these, because it'll be specific to your field, but it's going to get deeper and more intense. So get used to it. Okay, get used to it and understand and try to learn. The more you critically analyze something, I read up until I started teaching this class in 2011. I've been using that paper since 2012, and I actually took a course in that in 2010, where that paper was used. Actually, he was my teacher, okay, over at CMU. He's a CMU professor. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, and I have read that thing every semester with my class since 2012. Plus I read it when I took his class. and I came up with different angles, or students would use something in their paper, because we all did papers all the time, that would be a new angle to me almost every semester up until last fall. That's a long time to be reading something and still finding new angles in it, right? So they're definitely harder to read. These two are a little bit easier, they're more laid back. These are definitely older school academic papers, okay? So the trend has been, and something I didn't know until I attended a conference here at Mid, was a lot of people, especially post 1950, after World War II, a lot of people ended up getting their bachelor's degrees, much more so than in previous generations. So there were a lot of people who came out and began to have these bachelor degrees. But the elusive graduate degree has always been a much smaller number than it is for the bachelor degree. It's a lot more studying, it's a lot more money, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you have the privilege of being able to attend graduate school in whatever field you're going into, your obligation to the society in which you live is to share that knowledge that you gain. And trust me, graduate school is a whole other animal. It is you think you learn shit in K through 12 when you hit college, and then you think you learn shit when you're done with your bachelor degree. When you hit graduate school, you get deep dives into all these different rich topics, no matter what field you're going into. So you're obligated to share that with people who are unable to have that privilege. Well, if you're Larry Tift and Ernest Vandenhag, they wrote for publication to other people who had graduate degrees. They didn't adhere to that tenet of sharing the knowledge with other people. Because if you haven't attended college, unless you're in the higher echelon of your graduating class, the average person will have extreme difficulty navigating those. And they're not going to be something that they're going to read for fun, right? So the goal now has been moving away from the dry, heavily academic language and into language that will be able to reach a larger audience. Just so they can share those ideas and those concepts and those philosophies to people who don't necessarily even have a high school diploma. So therefore, it's gotten easier. But those two are the old school, and you're gonna find, when you start doing papers throughout your college, you're gonna find those older articles that are, you read the abstract and go, oh my God, this is so good, this has just shook my world. And then you start reading it, it's old school academic. So get used to it now. And know that pretty much all the articles you read for college papers, you're gonna need to read 2 times, at least. Don't feel bad, okay? I graduated in the top 3 percentile of Catholic school, and I went to a really good Catholic high school that didn't graduate. But anyway, I was too smart for my own good. But I was always at the top 3%, and these befuddled me when I first got a hold of them. So it doesn't matter. And a lot of it is what words and ideas and concepts and strategies in writing you have become used to in your life thus far. So this is exposing you to different ways. So you have that knowledge behind you. Has anyone here read, oh God, I just have James Baldwin. Has anyone here read anything by James Baldwin? James Baldwin. Amazing writer and philosopher and civil rights activist and gay man. Well before, matter of fact, I don't think he ever really came out, but it was well known he was gay. So it was just something you do, kind of like everybody knew Elton John was gay way before he came out, right? Or Liberace. Does anyone do you know who I'm talking about when I say Liberace? Anyone? Oh my God. Like the women, the baby boomer, and even their parents loved him. He was a pianist, a very showy, kind of glam pre-rock glam. And I looked at it and it was so funny because, the time I saw Liberace, he was probably in my probably 10 or 12 years old, I knew he was gay. Like, it didn't take a big hit and, it didn't take a big swing to figure out that he was probably gay. But you couldn't come out, right? So, okay, anyway, James Baldwin was born very poor to a single parent who's, I don't even think that he knew who his father was. His mother came and moved from the deep south to New York City to have a better opportunity in life and brought her child with her. And he grew up in a poor area, went to poor schools, but one teacher, this is what teaching can do, made such a difference in his life that he ended up going to college, and he ended up becoming a renowned philosopher, civil rights activist, and writer. But even though he didn't grow up around this, because his teacher had exposed him to a large vocabulary and ways of doing things, and school was different then, education was different, it didn't dumb it down as much as it does today. His writing is sometimes difficult to follow. So he was caught at a very early age and socialized into that. So let's just stop and think of Jeannie and Danielle. When we're talking about this with socialization process and murderers and people, blah, blah, blah. People who end up on death row. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. We do have the midterm instructions. There's a video on botched executions. So pharmaceutical companies no longer make the drugs that you used to make for lethal injections. So therefore, because us and Japan are the only two countries that still have the death penalty, that are post-industrial nations. So what they've had to do is try to come up with a different cocktail to figure out what's going to work. And it doesn't always work. And so you do know that the Constitution says there should be no cruel and unusual punishment. And they actually, for a moment, got to stay on the death penalty for a brief minute. But then, much like abortion, the Supreme Court threw it back to the states. So there are some states that have death penalty and some, Michigan does not have it. But so these botched executions where, and the one that, I don't know if it shows this one or not, but there was a really good video I cannot find anywhere anymore. It was a 60-minute short. Where the guy had become addicted to methamphetamines. He had a very bad habit. His wife left him because of it. Her parents owned a business. She worked for her parents. And for some reason during one of his meth-induced, whatever, maybe up for 4 or 5 days or whatever they was up for, he went in and shot the parents and his ex-wife, and wounded somebody else in the business. He was obviously caught because meth heads aren't known for their stellar criminality. And went ahead and he got convicted and got put on death row. So during that time he dried up, right? During that time he became clean, sober, he apologized, he wrote letters of apology and remorse, but he had the death penalty. There's no going back from that, right? So he went through the whole process. Why is there such a long process between the time someone's convicted of capital murder and the time they're actually executed? Does anyone have any ideas of why that might be?
Isn't it to gather the most evidence possible to prove whether or not they actually did it without a
Right.
doubt?
That's the goal. That's the intention. The good intention is there. That it gives them a longer time for their attorneys or pro bono attorneys to argue that if there was evidence that might prove that they were not guilty of that. So, so this long process, and during that time, there's no going back from it, and he goes to get executed, and he does apologize, and then they give him the drugs, and one of them's a paralytic. So has anyone ever watched a fish, like you've gone fishing and you toss the fish in the boat, and that's what happened to him for an hour before he died finally, before his heart finally stopped. And the witnesses there, except for 2 of the relatives, I think it was the woman's sister-in-law and brother, his ex-wife's sister-in-law and brother, or whatever. And so this happens a lot. There are times that they've had to actually stop the execution because it's not working, and then wait till the next day and try again. So is that now cruel and unusual punishment? Okay. So in this video that I can't find anymore, they had Judge Kaminsky, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, is pro-capital punishment, and he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and they were talking about this. Well, is it because the Supreme Court, when it gave the stay, was because against the thing of cruel and unusual punishment. And so they said, isn't this now the very definition of cruel and unusual punishment? And he said, I don't think so. He said, but maybe we shouldn't do lethal injections anymore. There are other ways that, we used to have hanging picnics, bring the family down, right? I mean, that was a big, in the US.
Didn't they have the gas chambers too?
The gas chambers weren't a picnic because they had to be inside. But they had the gas chambers, they had electrocution, but the hangings used to be an all-day event, come bring the family out, get a picnic, sit down, because hanging doesn't take place like that. right?
Same thing with the guillotines.
Yes.
They made a public spectacle of those as
Yes,
well. in
and the
France.
guillotine actually was invented to help alleviate the problem with chopping somebody's head off with an axe. That it didn't always work right the first time.
Or someone would miss, or
So, right, so this way, the guillotine was very severe and swift, and it was guaranteed a success. So Kaminsky says, he says, I don't know if we should, let's do firing squads, which was another way we used to execute people. And he said, firing squads? He said, yes. He said, and I think they should be televised. And he goes, well, isn't that brutal? Isn't that cruel and unusual and brutal? And he goes, yes, it's brutal, and if we can't stomach that, then we shouldn't be executing. And I'm like, wait, now, are you pro or anti? Because you just gave me a huge argument against, even though all your rulings have been pro. So now I'm confused. That's where you get that gray area, right? But is he right? And again, we are one of 2 post-industrial countries that still has the death penalty. And I don't think Japan's used it much in the last 50 years. So, the bottom line is when you think about these are things you want to go through the process. And you have to read all 4 of the articles, because while I assign you a side to argue with, you're still going to need to know what the other side's going to argue. You need to get a preview to anticipate it, so you can make sure you have that in your arsenal when you go to argue. And debate teams never get to choose what side they argue, just to let you know.
So are you gonna, like,
Yep, I'm
put us
gonna
in
give.
groups on? who's
Didn't I give
for-
you guys 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2? No, okay. I do it so often now, it doesn't even phase me. Death row statistics, that's the one that you can go search all kinds of stuff. They have. Come on, there we go. They have racial demographics. If you look at racial demographics, whoops. So 40% of people on death row are black, and just under 42% are white. Doesn't sound unequal, does it?
no.
They're not, not more black people on death row,
More white
but,
people.
but what is wrong with that picture? Why is that inequality slapping us in the face?
It's like 16% of the population is black people.
60%, 70% now of the general population is black in the US. So that should statistically be closer to 20%. Right. So white is still the majority by far, by a lot. Same with even Latinos. Latinos are another group that are definitely overrepresented. Not as much as black people, but definitely overrepresented on death row. So when you look at data, that's what you have to ask yourself. That looks equal, but is it? Okay. When you look at the general demographics of the country. Vanden Heuvel gives an interesting excuse, and I think it's actually pretty good, but if you kill more white people, it wouldn't make it more equal. And so I understand, like I said, Vanden Heuvel does a great job of taking those arguments that abolitionists have and breaking it down, tearing it apart, and trying to tell you why they're wrong. Okay. It also has, go back, I'm gonna go flip it back. There you go, prisoners that are on death row. And I want you to look at the states that have the death penalty. The ones that are gray do not have the death penalty.
Other than Michigan and Gray, because we do have the death penalty.
No, we don't.
I thought we
certainly
did.
do not. Nope. So you'll see that the majority of them are in the South and that have heavy populations on death row, except for California. And ironically enough, when we talk about Manson in a minute, one of the women,
Sharon Tate.
not Sharon, no, Sharon Tate was murdered. One of the women who murdered her, Krenwinkel, Patricia Krenwinkel. Cause Manson didn't murder anybody.
He ordered it.
He didn't even order it. He gave them suggestions.
I actually got to see him, I was at the hospital in Bakersfield. and
Oh
he
my
was at-
God.
He was at Corcoran Prison, it was just around the time he died,
Uh-huh.
and they took him, well, they kept it under like wraps, like what hospital he was at,
Uh-huh.
cause when he went to the hospital, it was all over the news. Well, I was in the emergency room that night,
Oh my God.
and they brought him through, and they had him up on the 5th floor, and they had like, they took all.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That whole.
He's a
floor.
little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
Oh, yeah.
We'll get into that in a minute. But anyway, he didn't really actually kill anybody. He actually didn't even order them, but he gave them very strong suggestions on what to do. And it was young girls who are your age in this classroom right now.
One of
The
them
young
just got
women.
out of prison.
Huh?
One of his followers just got out of prison, like,
That's Patricia Krenwinkel. No, she didn't. She got paroled. She didn't get out of prison. The reason why, you have the Democratic governor of California, right? Everybody knows him, Gavin Newsom. The parole board gave her, let her go on parole, out on parole, and he stopped because the governor can do that. And the reason he gave is on crime was so intense. They butchered a woman who was 8 months pregnant, okay? And then butchered a whole bunch of other people. And wrote death to piggies and all kinds of shit in their blood. So his thing, now here's the thing, she was your age when she got under his spell
Really?
and started doing drugs. She ran away to California to Haight-Ashbury, met up with Charlie. He was charming. I don't know how, but whatever. Got them under the spell, had a whole harem of young girls around him. And 3 or 4 of them went to go murder these people on 2 different dates.
There's a movie about it, I think it's called Summer of Sam, or,
No, that's a different one, but it's close. There's one on Netflix.
yeah, I can't remember.
And then there's
the
another
show.
one with Brad Pitt that kind of goes over that, but it didn't happen because something else happened. Like
Yeah.
something, the butterfly flapped its wings, so therefore
But
Manson
it
didn't
shows
kill
the
him.
murders of Sharon Tate and her,
I've got a short video on that, really short video on that, documentary. Like 10 minutes. Anyway, she's a different person. She's me now, older than me. She's in her 70s. She's changed. Now, they were all sentenced to death, but they came in during that wave with this SCOTUS, put a moratorium on the death penalty, and then sent it back to the states. But their sentences were commuted at that point. Once they're commuted, you can't go back. So she didn't end up getting executed. But he wouldn't let her out. She's in her 70s. Do you really think she's gonna go out and kill anybody? Probably not, okay? And she's expressed remorse. I mean, she's had Diane Sawyer, who's a famous journalist, was trying to get her parole. Same thing with the other one, Leslie Van Houten.
yeah.
And she's another one. And they're in their 70s. They're 20 years older than I am. Oh, 80s, 20 years older than I am. So anyway, God, I'm getting old.
I'll be 50 this year.
Anyhow, then, so they're gonna incarcerate her till her death. Manson, on the other hand, and you'll see that from some of the videos, and maybe not so much, like, he's not gonna be redeemable. He spent 90% of his life incarcerated. Either in youth homes, or orphanages, and then juvenile detention facilities, and then jail, and then prison. And he was out for a few short years, and that's when he got the harem and did the whole thing. However, and I want you to remember this, Manson was part of the MK Ultra. Does anyone know what that is?
And that would the CIA use LSD to like brainwash kids into following directions.
They did tests on people, college students and prisoners, of which Charles Manson was in prison at that time. And they gave them increasingly higher doses of LSD to try to see if they could break them. Looking to see how they could break Soviet spies if they were to catch them. So between being raped from the time he was in an orphanage, before he was even in trouble, to be a group home, youth home, right? Being raped by the caregivers at that point, the people who were hired to take care of kids. And then later by older boys when he went to youth centers, and the guards or the people who worked for the facility. And then, of course, we all know what happens in prison, right? And he was a little guy, he's 5'2", he's my size. Yeah, don't drop the soap. So, you know, he has said, when he's lucid, you created me. Society created me. So is he right? And if so, do we have an obligation to admit that we were wrong? And then what do we do? He died of old age, right?
Yeah.
In prison. So because his sentence
He
was
had some
commuted.
health complications, I guess.
Well, he was old. He was, you know, all of us should live that long.
Creepy though.
Well,
Even the way cause like he stares you down, and I like, the guards like kind of blocked him,
Yeah.
but I was like, oh.
he definitely has. I have my son's father was a lot like that
And
person.
when
except for not
he
murderous,
had
thank
one
God.
follower, I guess, that would write him and everything, and they cremated him, and the guy wanted to do like a service at one of the churches
Uh-huh.
in Bakersfield, and he went to a Catholic one, and they said no, but they had like a back, like little thing, and they said you can do it in there, but you have like less than an hour to do it. Nobody wanted his body like or his ashes in their church and stuff.
Yeah. So you can look up and then you can also look in and see what the murder rate per capita is. So, just let you know, most of the time, not all the time, there's always outliers. But a lot of this, where the death penalty is in place and there's a lot of people on death row, and they tend to execute people more often, have higher per capita murder rates than states that do not have the death penalty. Not all of them. In California, I think is that Arizona? See, that's Colorado, that's New Mexico. That's gotta be, one of those gotta be. God, I used to be good at geography. That so sucks. Anyway, there are a couple states that do have the death penalty that have lower per capita murder rates, but not for the majority. The majority they have higher per capita murder rates. So does the death penalty really prevent people from committing crimes? You have to remember too, that except for the people like Charles Manson and Ted Bundy, who's another person we'll talk about, most of the time murders are committed as crimes of passion, in the heat of the moment. In anger, frustration, whatever.
And they had, you remember that, I don't know, the Green River Killer? He was
Yeah.
supposed to be put up on death row too, but I don't remember what happened with that one.
Washington State does not have the death penalty.
Well, they caught him in Utah or California.
If he committed murders there, then he would have, but.
He went all the way up the coast.
Yeah. Edward Lee Elmore, a man with an IQ of about 80, black man, who was living with his mother, and one of the people in the neighborhood close to them, close enough where he could walk or bike, an older elderly white woman, would hire him to do odd jobs, run groceries for her, clean her house, fix a door, whatever, right? Because he could handle that. She felt sorry for him. She was brutally murdered and raped. And of course, because his fingerprints were everywhere, and this is before DNA too, his fingerprints were everywhere, so he was guilty because he's black and she's white. That's just the way it worked, especially in the South. So he was convicted, sentenced to death, and he was never exonerated, even though when DNA evidence came through, they found that the person who probably murdered her, who was already dead, was her next door neighbor who was an elderly white man. So this is why we go on, in theory, it's to make sure that innocent people don't get executed. In reality, they could never get, because you have to, in order to make appeals, you have to make objections. You object, Your Honor, I object, Your Honor. They do that because if you don't object in court, you can't appeal that later on.
So if their attorney doesn't, like, when the prosecutors say.
Or you have to prove that the representation was so
So, like,
incredibly bad.
I just read an article about this 55-year-old, he was a white paramedic,
Uh-huh,
and supposedly he was accused of murdering a real estate agent.
uh-huh,
But then the night of his execution, he wanted to see his 8-year-old daughter.
uh-huh.
And they brought her in and she whispered to him that her mom was on the phone and told them that he wasn't there, but he was at the house. So the daughter was a witness.
Right.
But, and when
I think
she-
that was on Forensic Files, wasn't it?
I think so,
Yeah.
yeah. And like, they stopped his execution.
That's rare.
and he got
Cause you have to
out.
get the governor to stop it, that's
That's what they did in
extremely rare.
emergency, like the warden, this whole article said like, once the officer heard what the little girl
Right.
said, they called the warden called the government, and he ended up getting out that same day.
Right,
But he was in there 6 years.
right, so this guy was in there 30 years, and the only way they could let him out of jail, knowing he was probably innocent, because he'd gone through the process of all his appeals and he'd been exhausted, he was inches away from being executed, they commuted his sentence, so he's still not exonerated. He still has the murder conviction on his, and he's also spent the last 30 years in jail, so he's in his 60s. What do we do? Right, these things happen. Like you said about that man, right? This is not outliers. And has anyone heard of the Innocence Project?
Yeah,
Do you know what that is?
it's an organization that, people make appeals to them to look at their case and try to prove that they're innocent.
Yeah, so it started off as Loyola Law School in Chicago, did it as a capstone project for their seniors in law school. And what they did is they took a look at all the evidence, because this is as DNA was starting to become prevalent. They took a look at all the cases on Illinois' death row. And they began looking at all the cases and seeing which ones might have the possibility to be overturned with DNA evidence. And it was so extreme where they found, I think, a lot of people that some ended up being completely exonerated, some had to go through a process, and some never really got out, but, you know, they know they're innocent. And so it's now nationwide, and it's done all over the country, and people do a lot of lawyers that are already graduated do a pro bono, most of the law schools do some work in it. And, now they only take on cases that they can look at and say with some reasonable certainty that there were errors made and this person is probably innocent. And they get it usually through people, either relatives or the inmates themselves writing. So this is still a high number. Even if it's 5 people on every death row, you looked at the numbers of how many people are on death row, even if there were 5 people in each state, that's more people. What if that were you? What if that were your brother, or your uncle, or your son? Okay, I'm going to this. Now I'm going to go to, thought I had this. This up here. Yeah, all that. All the way. All of that. Okay, and so I had an interesting, epiphany. This last week, I was sitting in, Whitbeck in my wait for my second bus. And a woman was next to me, she had converted to Catholicism, she had been Protestant, I think she was Baptist before that. And, we were talking about my priest who gives me, reason to rethink whether or not I'm gonna continue going to the same church or not. And, I was telling her, Catholicism, we believe there are 3 levels. And that's not in the Bible, so I have my doubts about this, okay? But that there's heaven and hell, which is pretty much throughout, but there's also purgatory. So we get that thing where you get punished, it's a timeout. You don't get to go straight to heaven, you go in purgatory, pay your dues, and then you get to go to heaven. My problem with some of, not all of them, because not all of them believe this, some of the Protestant religion sects, is that they believe you can be Hitler your whole life, and as long as you're laid dying, you accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, boom! Good to go! All the way up to heaven, stairway to heaven, there you go. And I have a problem with that. And that's why I started thinking about what we were talking about in class, about socialization, and how hitting children does no good, and it can actually cause some of the ACEs, and you know, you should reason with children and try to get them, and that's kind of the standard application now. It's not necessarily punishment, or if it's punishment including explanation, not just because I said so. And forgiveness, right? Being able to redeem yourself through better actions and better choices at some point in the future, and you're going to learn more from that. And I'm thinking, well, if I kind of say this for one, you know, and then so I was talking to the priest who shall not be named at this point, and because she says she still believes it. That's one tenet she's carried over from her Protestant days. And so I said, that's a real problem I have. And then I talked to my priest about it, and he said, well, you know, Jesus forgave the man on to the right or left of him when he was on the cross, and, you know, he, just because he accepted him, right? And what the lady at Woodbets told me is God forgives. God is all forgiving. And then I'm thinking, this is now a personal journey I have to go on to decide how this aligns with what I had believed previously, my own social reality and social construction of reality. Do I believe that to be true? And then if so, because Jesus also says turn the other cheek, right? So I'm like, I gotta think about this. So this is my own journey I'll be going on over spring break and probably over the summer. And I may never arrive at a good answer, but it's gonna be something that's gonna be in the back of my mind all the time. So, I digress. But anyway, so Manson, and then there's Bundy, right? Ted Bundy, you guys know who he is?
Mm-hmm.
He was the man who, when he was being sentenced in Florida to death row, he went ahead, the judge, because he represented, he was in pro per. And he said, young man, if life had played out differently, if you'd made different choices, I would love to have you in my courtroom as a lawyer. But you didn't. And then he threw the book at him, right? But this is also, who was a 19-year-old man going to Washington State University, had dinner at the governor of Washington State's house, and was being tapped to potentially run for Washington State Senate, and then maybe even for National Senate, to the US Senate. They were grooming him because he was in law school, pre-law. And they thought that he was good looking, charismatic, and it was very intelligent, that he would be good. And who knew what he was doing on the side, right? He even had a fiance who had a daughter, a young girl daughter, that he was living with while he was committing these murders, of which many of them, or some of the murders, because he went cross country to the murders. He took it nationwide. And he was executed when he was already sentenced, and it was pretty much looking like he'd run out all his things. While he didn't tell them where all the bodies were buried, which was bad, because then they never get closure, he did say with with a lot of conviction that he could control it for a time if they were to let him out. But in the end, he would kill again. So if you're anti-capital punishment, what do we do about those people? You know, this is why I'm saying there's shades of gray, right? Do we only execute the people who are 100% irredeemable? Or do you just say, no, we keep them? And stop and remember Norway. You remember Norway, right? And 27 years is the highest sentence, except for, I believe I told you about the man who executed all those kids on that island. And he's not getting out. His 27 years, he went before their version of a parole type board. And they said no, because he shows no remorse, and he would say he would do the same thing all over again. So he's not getting out. Not unless he has to come to God, come to Jesus mode, right? So, so these are all things to consider when you're looking at this. And you guys have literally 2 weeks now. I have the Manson murders, I have Ted Bundy, this is the one, this is good because it flips both sides. He's an abolitionist who became pro-capital punishment. And it's a newer article and it's very casual, it's not in a professional journal. But it's very interesting to hear the narrative of what made him change his mind. Okay, why he went from one way to the other. And then the Manson interview, you gotta see it just because Charlie's a little bit crazy. And then you have to wonder how much MK Ultra, and how much his upbringing, his socialization. Because we all know what happened to Danielle and Jeannie. We all know that ACEs cause, remember those dysfunction of the brain and warrior genes, And the difference between that guy becoming a killer and being a great family man, albeit kind of a crappy dad sometimes, and him being a killer was the fact that he had a great upbringing. Charles Manson did not have that. So consider all these things when you are going through to consider what, how you're gonna frame your argument. And also what you believe. Because the way the side I set you up on may not be the side you believe in. Okay. And debate teams used to be huge, they're still huge in Ivy League schools. You can still get scholarships. But they don't tell, you don't get to choose which side you're gonna argue, they tell you which side you're gonna argue, much like we're gonna do here. And it allowed people, they were very popular in high schools, it allowed people to see both sides of any issue. It gave you insight into the other person's view, which was, I think, something we are grossly missing. What is gender? A lot about it, gender.
What we are living at.
Okay, anybody want to, what do you mean by what we are?
The biological makeup of your body, XXXY, that determines what you become when you grow older, or when you're born, I suppose. Not older, born.
That's what this is.
Sex.
Biological sex. That is not what gender is. What is gender? Yeah.
The sex you identify with and express to the rest of society, so.
Okay, so it's socially constructed like race. Gender is not biological. Vision of labor. Socially constructed rules and behaviors associated with what we think your biological sex is. Is gender binary? Binaries mean to choose. There are two genders in Western Civ, right? Whether we want it, whether we agree with it or not, that's what the common construction of reality is, right? Male and female, that's it. Is that the only way to look at it? You're shaking your head, what do you mean?
I mean, I feel like there's a lot of people who don't look at it that way.
Do all human cultures have binary gender roles?
No.
No. A lot of areas of the world, including the indigenous peoples, had at least 3 genders, right? So, and a lot of, how do I want to term this? Societies in Asia also have more than 2. 2 is kind of brought on by the brothers of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Zoroastrianism. And they had 3, the 2 spirits. 2 spirits means you had a little bit of each in you. That was blessing by the Great Spirit. If you were a 2-spirited person, that 3rd gender, you were revered and wise beyond your time, right? Because you had both. You had both. You could see things from multiple perspectives. Your treasure. Biological sex. Binary, you threw out some letters. What are those letters?
XX and XY.
Okay. Is that all there is?
No.
Biological sex?
Why,
Huh?
is there why?
This one that just has X. There's multiple variations. And that's just your chromosomes. There's genes on your chromosomes, and they express themselves at different points in your life. either in utero, where you're supposed to start developing different sex parts, sex organs, all the way through till boys get lower voices, girls don't, boys grow facial hair, girls don't, girls get periods, boys don't. That expression begins to come out. So there are multiple genes on the chromosomes, the sex chromosomes, that help express your sex. And wait till you see the video. I would just go through and explain more, but it just goes in. Okay.
Thanks for coming in to talk about Dungeon Union's
Of course, third grade is when I learned Liberty Mutual could save you hundreds by customizing your car insurance.
In high school biology, we usually learn that the sexes in humans are fixed and concrete. Whether you're male or female is black and white and rooted in your DNA. Your 23rd pair of chromosomes is either 2 X chromosomes or an X and a Y. That's it, end of story. And that's essentially what scientists thought too. But it turns out that sex isn't that straightforward. In fact, biologists today are saying sex is a spectrum, and the scientific community is still working on understanding and respecting the people who fall in the middle of that spectrum. To get this out of the way right up front, we're not talking about gender or sexuality here. Gender refers to social and cultural attributes and understandings of men and women and their roles, though not every culture has only 2 categories, and it's increasingly seen as a spectrum. Plus, the gender you identify as may or may not be the same one as what you express with things like your clothing and behavior, all of which can also be on a spectrum. Sexuality describes who you are attracted to, and it can be equally complicated and on a spectrum, and where you are on these spectrums isn't necessarily fixed. What we are talking about today is your biology, including your chromosomes, your hormones, your gonads, and your genitals. The catch is that these biological features don't always agree with each other. And they certainly don't always conform to those high school health class diagrams that tell us there's a single, universally correct pathway to being male and female. In fact, it's estimated that nearly 2% of live births are born with congenital conditions of atypical sex development. That basically means that something in their chromosomes, hormones, gonads, or genitals is different from what many people expect of a boy or a girl. This used to be known as being intersex, but these days it's better described as having differences of sexual development, or DSDs. And while nearly 2% might not sound like a lot, it means that there could be 130 million people or more with DSDs. If all those people were in one country, it would be among the top 10 most populous countries in the world. Plus, DSDs are not always something you can see. People can spend their whole lives thinking they're one sex based on anatomy, only to find at least part of them tells a different story. You see, your sex is the result of both sexual determination and sexual differentiation. Sexual determination has to do with what chromosomes you get. Those largely determine what happens to your body during sexual differentiation, the process by which you develop the physiological characteristics associated with your sex. And contrary to what you might think, that differentiation doesn't stop when you're born. It continues throughout your life. And that means there are a lot of moments when differences between people can happen. So of course, there are a ton of different outcomes. We tend to put these outcomes into 2 boxes based on visible anatomy, or what scientists call phenotypes. Phenotypical males have testicles and a penis, while phenotypical females have ovaries, a uterus, a vagina, and vulva. But in reality, none of the traits we use to discriminate between the sexes are truly binary. There's a lot of variation within what we call male or female, and there's a lot of overlap that's normal too. Anatomically, someone might look phenotypically female on the outside, but not have ovaries or a uterus, or have tissues from both ovaries and testes. And genetics aren't any clearer, because when it comes to chromosomes, People don't always just get two X's or an X and a Y. X's and Y's contain genes that help determine sex, with the Y chromosome conferring the genes that enable you to develop male reproductive parts. But the processes for producing sperm and eggs are really complicated, and they can lead to lots of different results. In this process, abbreviated version, specialized cells basically duplicate themselves, then undergo 2 rounds of division to produce reproductive cells, or gametes, that have half of the parent genetic material. So it makes one set of 23 chromosomes. But sometimes the chromosomes don't split into exact sets of 23, and that means there are a whole bunch of possible combinations of X's and Y's that a person can end up with. For instance, people can inherit 3 X's or an X and 2 Y's. These folks are normally taller than average. Those with 3 X's have slender builds and sometimes have minor learning disorders. The people who have an X and 2 Y's, on the other hand, tend to have more acne because of the extra testosterone in their systems. In both cases, people retain full fertility. Then there's Turner syndrome, which happens when you just get 1 X. That results in female characteristics, but the people who have it tend to be shorter, don't really go through puberty, and may have mental disabilities and are sterile. And Klinefelter syndrome, which results from 2 X's and a Y, is the most common chromosomal sex anomaly. It happens in 1 in 600 male births and can cause lower testosterone production and cause incomplete testicular development, though the symptoms can be minor enough that a person isn't diagnosed until later in life. Now, there's also the fact that all your cells in your body don't necessarily have the same chromosomal makeup, which, like,
That's it. We're switching teams.
You can't just switch.
I mean, we just switched to Verizon. Got 4 new iPhone 17 Pros
Yeah,
on
just
them.
switch to Verizon, pay $30 or more per month.
Come to Verizon and get 4 iPhone 17 Pros on them.
what? Did I learn nothing but lies in high school? But it's true. Someone with mosaicism can develop from a single fertilized egg but have a patchwork of genetically different cells. And someone who's a genetic chimera has different cells because they develop from 2 different fertilized eggs that merge in the womb. In both cases, it's possible to end up with a mix of cells with different sex chromosomes. And depending on the distribution of those cells, mosaicism and chimerism can result in ambiguous sexual characteristics or both male and female reproductive body parts. It's even been shown that pregnant people and their fetuses frequently swap stem cells through the placenta in a phenomenon known as microchimerism. That means a chromosomal female can be carrying around XY cells, and her son can have XX ones. In some studies, these cells have been shown to stick around in the mother for several decades. But all that said, there are also plenty of people with double X or XY chromosomes that also have differences of sexual development. That's in part because at least 25 genes play a role in sex differentiation. So both mutations and relocations of these genes can result in a range of differences. Genes necessary for male development can be swapped onto the X chromosome, for example, or someone can end up with multiple or mutated versions of other sex-determining genes. And some of these are on other chromosomes and are inherited as run-of-the-mill recessive traits. All of these genes really start to be influential around 6 weeks of development. You see, at 6 weeks, the fetus has a pair of bulges called the gonadal ridges next to its kidneys, and they have the potential to develop into ovaries or testes. The fetus at this point also has 2 sets of ducts. One set can develop into the uterus and fallopian tubes, while the other set has the potential to become the epididymis, vas deferens, and seminal vesicles. And what happens from there is somewhat of a balancing act of different genes working in concert. Essentially, different networks of genes shout male and female, and when that balance gets knocked slightly askew, it can move a person along the sex spectrum. Take SRY, discovered in the 1990s. This is the male programming gene, and it has a big effect on development. If it ends up on the chromosome of someone who is XX, it can cause them to develop testes instead of ovaries. This can happen because there's a step in sperm and egg production when chromosomes swap some DNA with their partner chromosomes. And even though the X and Y chromosomes generally don't join in on this DNA swapping process, they sometimes do. Plus, other mutations that occur during the production of gametes can result in multiple normal or mutated versions of SRY or other sex-determining genes because it's not the only gene that matters. There are also genes that actively encourage the fetus to develop female characteristics. For instance, the gene WEAT4 suppresses testicular development and promotes ovarian development, and multiple copies of it can cause incomplete female gonads to develop in people who are XY. Gonad development also triggers the production of sex-specific hormones, which results in further sex-specific development. But some people have differences of sex differentiation that limit their ability to respond to those hormones. Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is one of these. People who have it are unaffected by male sex hormones because they have some kind of mutation to the protein that these hormones bind to, called the androgen receptor. And that means that while they have testes and a Y chromosome, their exterior genitals appear female or in between. There's also congenital adrenal hyperplasia, the most common DSD out there. That's when the adrenal glands underproduce cortisol and overproduce androgens, the male hormone group that includes testosterone. The underproduction of cortisol can lead to health problems, while the overproduction of androgens can lead to external male genitalia paired with internal female gonads in people with XX chromosomes. Some of these conditions don't fully present themselves until puberty or later. In fact, some aren't realized at all until a person seeks some kind of medical care that reveals them. Like in 2014, doctors reported one case of a 70-year-old father of 4 whose, quote, hernia turned out to be a uterus with fallopian tubes. But in many cases, differences in sexual development are notable from birth. For those newborns, it may be possible to assign a gender based on what they're more likely to identify as they grow up. The thing is, with all of the things that can happen during sexual development, when a child is born with an obvious difference of sex development, it's not always clear why. Looking at chromosomes often isn't enough, and sometimes a hormonal test isn't either. And even if the child's doctors have a sense of what's going on, determining what, if any, treatment is necessary can be challenging. Back in the 1960s, it was thought that growing up without clearly defined sexual organs would cause emotional trauma. So there was a push towards performing surgery on infants to clearly assign them a sex. And because of social stigmas surrounding DSDs, parents were often encouraged to keep all of this a secret, even from the child. So people grew up without knowing kind of important details about their own bodies. It's hard to get numbers on how many of these surgeries were or even are being performed. It's also hard to know exactly how these surgeries affect patients. But as adults, many report pain, scarring, and a loss of sensation. Also, people with DSDs do report high rates of gender dysphoria, where their chosen gender does not align with their assigned sex. And there's an association between gender dysphoria and mental health issues like self-harm behaviors, so these surgeries may contribute to mental health problems later in life. Though it's important to note that such issues are less likely if people have supportive and affirming parents who...
That's an outfit I heard.
Entertainment, our former first mate will walk the plank.
Who accept them as they are. And sometimes surgery is medically necessary, like to unblock the urethra. Also, surgery can help to preserve fertility, or in the case of complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, to reduce the risk of testicular cancer. But from a medical perspective, those surgeries don't need to be performed on infants. In fact, most of the time, differences in genital anatomy at birth aren't something that needs to be fixed. At least not until the person is old enough to make their own choices about what they want their bodies to look like. So nowadays, healthcare is moving away from a surgical approach. If a DSD is identified at birth, treatment is more likely to include therapy and hormonal replacement than surgery. Often, a DSD team is involved in care, which can include geneticists, endocrinologists, and psychologists or psychiatrists. They help the family decide if any interventions are immediately and medically necessary, and help provide care and support to the child with DSD and their family throughout childhood. Unfortunately, this kind of care still isn't available everywhere. For now, researchers are working to better understand the development of both sex and gender over time, and to gain a clearer sense of when kids begin to understand their own gender identity. The problem, of course, is the fact that from clothes to restrooms to organized sports, they are raised in a society that is set up around a binary, that just isn't binary. But researchers are thinking about how we can make our overall discussions and understanding of sex even more inclusive and more accurate. Because even though biological sex may seem like one of those things that is relatively straightforward in a very, very complicated world, it's not. And while there's probably still a long way to go to understand it, we are making progress. Before we go, we'd like to give a special thank you to our patrons on Patreon.
Thoughts? Did any of that surprise you?
No,
Huh?
I didn't know something.
Yeah, I didn't know the swapping between mothers and sons. Like, what? Damn little son of a bitch. Gave me stretch marks and probably gave me some other junk too.
The only thing I know about my great nephew who's 4,
Uh-huh.
he has Angelman syndrome, and it's because he didn't get the 13th chromosome
Yeah.
from his mom.
Yeah. Yep. So, everybody hold their hand up with their fingers tight together like this,
Mine don't move.
up in the air. See yours. Your index is a little shorter than your ring. Same with you. 2 already in this class. Same with you, same with me, right? So, gosh, 4 already. 5, wow, I had 1 out of the other class. Okay, you got about even.
It's longer.
Your ring finger is longer. Your ring finger is longer.
No, my index one is.
Your index finger is shorter.
Isn't this the index finger?
Nope. Your index finger is here. Your ring finger is here.
It's different on both sides.
It is, but it's still shorter in this one, even if it's by micro degrees. Okay. You can start recording again, by the way.
Oh, I've done this whole
Okay,
thing.
good. Okay, so this tells you how much hormones and what kind of hormones you were exposed to in utero. No control over this. Your parents probably didn't go say, I'm gonna go take a whole bunch of testosterone or estrogen. If your ring finger is longer, even by just a little tiny bit, than your index finger, you were exposed to more testosterone in utero. If your ring finger and index finger are almost the same, pretty much the same, nothing special stands out. A little bit of both, right? Nothing big. And if your index finger is longer than your ring finger, which nobody in this class has, you were exposed to more estrogen in utero. And this can show up. You are a very forthcoming, energetic, and driven young woman. You are vocal. You have no problems expressing your opinions. Me. Okay? And that is probably somewhat attributable to your non-typical feminine gender role or gender traits. Because women aren't supposed to be like that. Women are supposed to be demure. They're supposed to be
So
quiet.
technically, all of us, not just in this classroom, but all of us have male and female.
Well, you have all. This is just something outside of what we just saw. This is other research that's been going on in the UK. And the guy will take a look if he's got runners that are getting ready to run a race, and they're all athletes, right? But if he measures the distance between the index and the ring finger, he can tell who's going to win and who's going to lose the race, and he's almost right 90% of the time who comes in the middle, what order they come in. Why is that? What do we know about testosterone?
It's fast.
It gives you more muscle, right? You're supposed to develop more muscle. You're supposed to be, as people take to enhance themselves, right? Athletes. Illegal, but they still do it. So, just one more piece of evidence that things aren't as cut and dry. I am a boisterous, loud, very adamant, and very strong woman, and I always have been, except for when I was a kid. But I was a tomboy when I was a kid, and it might explain that, I don't know. And part of that might be due to the difference in being exposed to more testosterone in utero, right? Which affects somehow some of your, because what we identify with gender role is different from the sexual expression, right? The biological sex. The other part coming socially would be I was raised in a predominantly African American area. My mother's friends were predominantly African American, And the dynamics in a black family, for the better part of most, again, not everybody's a monolith, is women tend to be the stronger people in the relationship. And so your grandma, right, your mom, these are people that take on stronger roles in a familial situation. And I learned that 5 years ago at a conference, 6 years ago now, at a conference on sociology on the dynamics of the African American family that they were the first generation who went to college, got a degree, and moved to the suburbs, predominantly white suburbs, and how those dynamics that are unique to African American families plays out differently when they go to school parent-teacher conferences. Crazy, very specific, right? But it was a study that was done on how teachers address the husband. Teachers address, right? They don't tend to address the mother as much. In white communities, African American communities, the wife is usually the one who's more vocal during the parent-teacher conference. So it is a different dynamic, and they were examining this. So these are all things when we talk about what we learn in class. And I know a lot of it's political, but it's political only because the people have made that political. That was not political, okay? When scientists discovered shit, we listened. And that is no longer the case. So, that being said, it looks like we're discussing politics, but we're discussing much more. When it looks at death penalty, yes, we're looking at an institution of deviance, crime, and punishment in societies. And yes, it's political, but yes, it's not. Right? So one more thing I want to leave you with, when we look, because we study racial inequality, income and wealth inequality, when it comes to keeping those people, and I know I talked about this for a minute, the non-redeemable people, like Charles Manson, like Ted Bundy. The costs of taxpayers to keep these people alive till they die, like Charles Manson, as opposed to executing them like Ted Bundy. What should we look at life and having a price tag? Because we always have these knee-jerk reactions, like in the Pinto thing, right, where they assigned a dollar amount for a loss of this, that, or the other life, and people were pissed because human life should be priceless. So is it the economy that's driving our ideas on arguing the benefits, costs and benefits of keeping someone in jail for the rest of their lives that's driving that concern? Is it the capitalist ideas and the economics behind it? Just something to consider, to think about as well. Really quick, I'm gonna go and say, this is awful and horrible, but unfortunately it was a true statement. My middle daughter, who was the quiet one, and she looked the most like her dad, and her dad treated her the best. Swear to God, he thought the youngest one was not his. I swear to God. Well, if I hadn't kept her the whole time and not let them take her, I would question if they switched them. Because she looked like neither of us. Okay, seriously. She had almond shaped, she looked like she was Eurasian. God, not Eurasian. Yeah, Eurasian, European and Asian. Like children of mixed ethnicity, extreme mixed ethnicity. She had almond shaped, and she looked like an Indian papoose with blue eyes. And so, and neither one of us, me nor Dad, had blue eyes. Both our parents did. Right, both our mothers did. But it was on and off. Long story short, he quit his really good paying job, $50,000 a year in 1990 was a good amount of money. It was like $100,000 a year now. And he quit it because he didn't want to pay child support when we got divorced. Took odd jobs here and there, worked for taxi cab service once in a while, just so he wouldn't have to pay any child support. I would drive the kids down from up here, up north, down to Detroit, which is where he lived on the edge of Dearborn, and have to pick up groceries on the way just so he could take them every other weekend. Eventually, the economy got so sucky ass, I could no longer do that. Gas went up to $5 a gallon after we invaded Iraq, and I had to start working more than one job. So he didn't make the effort on his own once I stopped doing that. And then he pretty much didn't talk to them hardly at all over the course of the next decade. And so he died of a sudden heart attack, a widowmaker, when my youngest daughter was a freshman in high school. And when he died, he was over $200,000 in arrears in child support. So you wonder how that can happen, right? We're living in the same state, but it happens. So anyway, bottom line is, my daughter, my middle one, the quiet one, the one who looked the most like him, the one who had the most positive time with him to a point, actually said, well, at least now we'll cut child support that he's dead, because you get Social Security death benefits. He had held a really good job for 20 years of life. He made good money. So we ended up getting I ended up getting $1,000 a month for each kid. So we went from poverty, by that time we were in poverty, all the way up to middle class, at least lower middle class living. We got to take vacations. When the gas bill went up, I didn't freak out. Little things. My car broke down, I didn't freak out for about 3 years, because the youngest one was in freshman year, and they get it through the end of high school. So, but to say that, I hate to say this, but at least now that Dad's dead, we'll get child support, and we won't be poor. That's a horrible way to look at human beings. She wasn't wrong, but she was saying what she felt at the time, and morally, isn't that apprehensible? Right, to have to feel that, oh, well, Dad died now, so at least we get money. Like, that's horrible, right?
At least we can be taken care of.
Yeah, at least we won't have to worry about having a car, because I don't think I had it. Yeah, I did have a car, but it was a POS. Okay.